Afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sandra Morgan, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's panel discussion, the third in our series on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This time, we'll be talking about the human cost of war. Absolutely timely conversation. These conversations acknowledge the strength and diversity of scholarship at Kent State University and with our partner organization this time, the University of Akron. We're both pleased and honored to have faculty members from the University of Akron join us in this conversation and partner with us in general in future conversations. Our panelists are all experts in their respective fields, and they will provide us with a nuanced and insightful perspective on current global events and more. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Neil Cooper, and our discussants, I'd like to remind you that your microphones are muted, but not your voices. We look forward to excellent conversation and your insightful questions. After the panelists have spoken, Dr. Cooper will ask your questions of the panelists, and he'll provide plenty of time for responses. You may ask the questions of the panel in general or of one individual. But remember, if you'd like an individual to answer, please direct your question directly to that person. And finally, as a reminder, to ask a question, please select the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type it there. You may also join the conversation in the chat section. And as always, we ask that your questions be courteous, productive, and on topic. So with that all being said, and without further ado, I'd like to turn over this panel discussion to Dr. Neil Cooper. Dr. Cooper?
Good afternoon. And welcome to what is now the third in a series of panels that we've been running on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think this particular panel is notable for two reasons. Firstly, it's the result of a collaboration between the Center for Conflict Management at the University of Akron and the College of Arts and Sciences at Kent State University. And I think the fact that across the range of the three different panels, we've been able to have such a wide range of speakers from so many different academic disciplines speaks to the depth, range, and quality of expertise we have on multiple themes connected to questions of peace and conflict throughout the region. Secondly, as Sandra has already noted, the theme for this panel is the human cost of war. So as well as discussing recent developments regarding Ukraine, our panelists will also be considering the human consequences of war, both war in general and the war in Ukraine specifically. And once again, just to remind you, each of our speakers will start with a presentation. We'll go through each of those presentations in turn, and then we will have an opportunity for questions. So please, as the speakers are speaking, do please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Before we begin, I would also like to thank the Center for Conflict Management at the University of Akron, and particularly Dr. Robert Peralta, the head of the center, for his work in coordinating events today. Also, Dr. Anthony Molina, the head of the politics department at Kent State, for the immense amounts of work he has put into both the inception and coordination of this series, and Dr. Molly Merriman, in the School of Peace and Conflict Studies, for the support she's provided in facilitating discussions about this panel. Last but by no means least, I would like to thank Sandra Morgan and her team in the College of Arts and Sciences for all the technical support they've provided that has meant that we've been able to bring this particular panel, and indeed all the other panels, to you. Finally then, let me very briefly introduce our speakers in the order that they will be talking. Our first speaker will be Dr. Karl Kaltenthaler, who is the director of the Center for Intelligence and Security Studies at the University of Akron. His research is on civil and international conflicts, and he will be speaking on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the conflict stands and where it may go. Our next speaker will be Dr. James Tyner, who is Professor of Geography at Kent State University and a Fellow of the American Association of Geographers. He will be speaking about the enduring costs of war. Our third speaker will be Dr. Karine Koifmann, who is an Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Kent State University. She has an active research program funded by the National Institutes of Health that is focused on examining the link between emotion processing, stress, and the risk of psychiatric disorders such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And her talk today will focus on the psychological consequences of war, including both the short and the long-term consequences. And then our final speaker will be Dr. Polina Vlasenko, who is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Akron. She has a Ph.D. in medical anthropology from Indiana University, and her research is on surrogacy and egg donation in Ukraine. So without further ado, I would like to hand things over to our first speaker, Dr. Karl Kaltenthaler.
Thank you for having me. This is obviously a very fluid situation. So what I'm going to be talking about today is where we stand now in terms of the conflict, and then where it's likely to go based on the information that we have now. So if we look at the conflict now, it has clearly not turned out the way that the Russian leadership had planned. There was an assumption that came into this invasion among the Russian leadership that they would be able to defeat the Ukrainians very quickly because of the superior numbers that the Russians have, both in terms of troops, in terms of armored vehicles, in terms of aircraft. And the assumption was also that the Russians had superior training to the Ukrainians. But what we've seen is that after the first few days of initial advances, this conflict has bogged down to a great extent. The Russians have been slowed outside of Kyiv. They've been unable to take many other major cities. They've made most of their advances in the south of the country. But the overall campaign is certainly not going the way the Russians had planned, foreseen, and this is looked at not just by the Russians, but by many countries as a sign that the Russians are actually much weaker than we had thought they were militarily. So it's important, I think, to point out some of the problems the Russians are having. Why are they bogging down the way they are? So some things that we see is that they're having a very hard time with logistics. So keeping their troops supplied, keeping their tanks with fuel, just various things that you would expect in a modern military, the Russians are actually having a very, very difficult time with. We're also seeing that their command is much poorer than we had thought. So the actual command of their troops is really not showing that they're very adept at a large-scale campaign. Another thing that we're seeing that is slowing the Russian down is significant problems with morale among their troops. We're seeing their troops give up when engaged in fights, but we're even seeing the troops before they get into actual combat abandon their vehicles or just simply flee the battlefield. So this is an important sign, because one of the things that we think about in conflicts is that they're very much a battle of wills, not simply a battle of weaponry and tactics. Finally, we see Russian equipment is breaking down. We're seeing the real problems with the maintenance of the equipment and actually very faulty equipment put into the battle from the beginning. So things that we had thought would be effective battlefield weaponry, such as tanks or aircraft or things like that, we're finding they're having real problems with it. And finally, what I would say is that this is not likely to get better soon for the Russians, that it's likely to get worse. And one of the things that's going to be a real problem for them soon is weather. And that is that as the ground warms up, and we're starting to see this in some parts of Ukraine, their vehicles are getting bogged down in mud. So that makes it much more difficult for them to maneuver, for them to use that armored force that they have, which is probably their single biggest trump card that they have over the Ukrainians. So another factor, obviously, that's making the Russians slow down is that they are fighting against a very well-motivated force. The Ukrainians are not about to give up. The Ukrainians are fighting back very hard, and we don't see any morale problems with the Ukrainians. So one of the things that we're seeing in the war is it's changing in terms of the nature of how the Russians are fighting the war. They're moving away from trying to use armored columns to quickly overrun Ukrainians to now using siege tactics and using indirect fire to target civilians. And so they're basically trying to terrorize the Ukrainian population into giving up, which is very unlikely to be the case. So, very important question to turn to then is, where does this conflict go from here? So I've come up with some scenarios and I'll discuss each one of them briefly. So one scenario is that the Russians get out of their slump that they're in now, and then they're able to break out and they're able to create an outright military victory. That is highly unlikely. And the reason why I say it's highly unlikely is that the Ukrainians are not about to give up. The Ukrainians are well supplied by their Western allies. And the Russians simply don't have enough forces in Ukraine to control the whole country. So the best the Russians could really hope for was that the Ukrainians would surrender. The Russians would have Ukrainians who cooperate with them. That's not happening. So the Russians are really in a pretty tight spot right now. Another scenario is a long, costly insurgency. So this means that the Ukrainians use a lot of the type of tactics that they're using now, but as the Russians continue to advance, this becomes more and more costly for the Russians. And what I mean by those tactics is hit and run type tactics, guerrilla tactics. Rather than sitting down and slogging it out with the Russians tank to tank, you would trick the Russians by using anti-tank weapons fired from concealed areas, and soon the Russians get so bogged down and there's so many losses that they really have to reconsider where they are. How likely of a scenario is this? I would say this is a likely scenario. And the reasons for this scenario being likely are all the same reasons that I gave for why the Russians are not likely to have an outright quick military victory or even a long-term military victory. A third scenario is that the Russians abandon the conflict. They simply say this is too costly. They go home. But important caveat here, they go home without achieving what they consider their top political goals. So, there was a list that Putin came up with before the war. You had to remove the Ukrainian leadership that he called Nazi. You had to disarm Ukraine. Ukraine obviously couldn't lean towards the West. There's been things that have been added to that. It's highly unlikely, I would argue, that the Russians are going to withdraw from Ukraine without achieving some of those political goals. And the major reasons for this is, one, Vladimir Putin, we know this, is very, very allergic to being humiliated. And that would be a humiliating defeat for him. The other thing is that could undermine Putin politically. And he's not about to give up his position of power voluntarily or weaken himself politically in Russia. So I think it's a pretty unlikely scenario. Another scenario that we need to consider, the fourth one, is that the Russians escalate, that they escalate in this conflict. And one of the things that we have to consider, it's not an impossibility, is that the Russians use what we call tactical nuclear weapons. And it is within Russian warfighting doctrine to use tactical nuclear weapons at a much lower threshold than what the United States uses or other Western countries use. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is that Russia attacks NATO bases that are supplying the Ukrainians. I think this is an unlikely scenario because the cost to Russia will be quite high. Very likely that you'd have retaliation if they use tactical nuclear weapons. And if they attack NATO forces, then you've got a war with NATO. A final scenario, the fifth scenario, is that you end up with a negotiated end of the conflict. And what that means is that the Russians and the Ukrainians work out some kind of deal where both sides give, both sides work out some kind of an arrangement where the Russians no longer feel threatened either militarily, or more importantly, I would argue, they feel threatened to their status by Ukraine. So there's a deal that's worked out where both sides feel it's win-win, but both sides are going to have to give. There's no question about that. And so we have an idea of what this deal might look like. So no to Ukraine NATO membership. The Ukrainians say we're not joining NATO. Another thing the Ukrainians say is that we're neutral. So we are not siding with the West. We are not siding with Russia. We're going to be neutral. Kind of think about Austria during the Cold War. Okay. Another thing that the Russians are demanding and the Ukrainians seem to be willing to give on is that Russia becomes another one of the official languages of Ukraine. So this has been a big thing for Putin. Here's the single biggest sticking point, though. The Russians are saying, okay, a non-negotiable part of that negotiated settlement has to be that the Ukrainian government recognizes Crimea as Russia, and that Luhansk and Donetsk become independent and become part of Russia. That is going to be the major sticking point, because for the Ukrainians, that is a major surrender of territory. And so far, we haven't seen willingness on the part of the Ukrainian government to give into that kind of thing. So the most likely scenario at this point, unfortunately, is a long, bloody insurgency, but I would not count out a negotiated settlement, because I think that is the second most likely scenario to this conflict. And thank you. I look forward to your questions coming forward.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really excellent summary of where we are in the kind of current state of the conflict. So our next speaker will be Dr. James Tyner. So over to you, James.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay enough? Okay. So to begin, wars are fought with uncertainty and imperfect information. And so too, the ability of academics to offer critical commentary on conflicts. So, we're here in Northeast Ohio, and to a large extent, following what's happening in the news and speculating. So my prepared remarks come in the context of ongoing work that I've been doing, specifically on the Cambodian genocide and other 20th century conflicts, partially to understand those conflicts and also to understand the legacy of those conflicts. Albert Schweitzer wrote in the aftermath of the First World War that from the history of the past, we can only infer what has been, not what will be. However, he does caution that the past survives, and in so doing may cast a poisonous shade over us. My comments, therefore, are a reflection on the poisonous shade that 20th century conflict has over the current crisis in Ukraine today. And I think that there's two ways that we can start to approach the ideas of the human cost here. Obviously, the first is the direct human cost, the injury, the maiming, the traumatization, and the killing of the men, women, children in Ukraine today. And I think we need to direct attention, as the previous speaker indicates, not only to the conduct of the war itself, particularly as it bogs down, and the likelihood that Putin will continue with terror activities, particularly as he is backed into a geopolitical corner here. But I think we need to consider also the type of weapons that are being used and the implications, both short-term and long-term, in terms of the human cost. Now, the first one, of course, is the use of cluster bombs. And there are numerous confirmed reports that Russia is using cluster bombs. And I think it's important to understand, particularly for the audience who may not be fully aware of what exactly cluster bombs are. Of course, there's a lot of different types of cluster bombs, but effectively, these are large fragmentation bombs. They are a large canister, and inside of those canisters, you have upwards of perhaps 300 different or smaller bombs referred to as bomblets. These can be dropped from aircraft, they can be launched from missiles, and they generally are going to detonate in the air, and upon detonation, release upwards of those 300 little bomblets that are going to fall randomly to the ground. These are indiscriminate weapons. They are not necessarily designed to kill, although they obviously do quite a bit. But depending on what is inside of those bomblets, a key component is actually to bring about widespread injury and maiming. These have been used throughout the 20th century. The United States used them indiscriminately throughout Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. They've been used in a number of other conflicts. And what makes these weapons exceptionally insidious is that upwards of 40% of those bomblets do not detonate. They lie dormant. And we'll get back to that when we talk about some of the longer term consequences of the human costs of the conflict here. Russia has in its possession thermobaric bombs. These have not been confirmed to be used, or at least I have not heard that these have been confirmed to be used. However, these are, unlike conventional explosive, these are the use of aerosol fuels to ignite oxygen to increase intense heat and pressure waves. And the weapon itself has a liquid accelerant and two explosive components. On detonation, the fuel is dispersed by the first explosive into a cloud of vapor that mixes with oxygen. That vapor cloud then spreads and infiltrates all areas that possible. The second explosion then ignites the fuel and creates an intense high temperature explosion and blast wave of pressurized air. The rapidity of the pressure damages internal organs, including lungs, which may literally explode, or else the bodies itself may be instantaneously vaporized. There are reports that are also unconfirmed that the Russian military is using so-called butterfly mines. These are similar to cluster bombs. They are deployed in a different matter. But these are plastic explosives and they resemble toy butterflies. And these also can be dropped from airplanes, helicopters, artillery, or mortar. And they float down randomly to the earth below. These are equipped with cumulative pressure fuses. So the mines don't necessarily explode on impact, but however, they remain armed until somebody treads upon them, or perhaps some child innocently plays with them, thinking it is a toy. Beyond that, the conventional artillery, tanks, fighter jets, increasingly targeting civilian populations, targeting infrastructure, targeting schools, targeting hospitals, maternity wards, and other non-military targets throughout the country as well. Now, all of this is for the immediate short term. But the longer term is something that needs to have more foreshadowing, I think, particularly when we take a look at any of the five, I believe you introduced 5 possible scenarios. What happens when these scenarios come to pass? Particularly when the world's attention is diverted to the next catastrophe, the next conflict. To what extent is there going to be the same type of rallying around the flag that we see today? And to put it into perspective, it's helpful to also then think about the continuity of the weaponry and the other forms of combat that are currently being used. So when we talk about the cluster bombs and we talk about the various butterfly mines, I indicated that oftentimes you might have upwards of 40% of those that are not detonated. Those are going to remain embedded in the ground for years, if not decades. In places like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, children to this day continue to be injured, if not killed, by the use of mines and cluster bombs, other unexploded ordnance. Farmers continue to be killed by these weapons. The question of chemical weapons, there is considerable speculation to the degree that Russia may use chemical or perhaps other radiological forms of weaponry. There's one component that I'd like to call attention to. Again, I cannot confirm that this is ongoing, but I want to direct attention to the idea of depleted uranium weapons. Beginning in the 1970s, a number of militaries were, a number of governments were confronted with the cost of what to do with depleted uranium, a waste byproduct of the generation of nuclear energy. And over the last 4 decades, they have been utilizing depleted uranium as armor plating on military vehicles and also on armor-piercing shells. Depleted uranium shells were widely used in the first Gulf War, and this is still somewhat of a contested situation. But for those of you who are old enough and you think back to the Gulf War syndrome, there are numerous accounts and studies that are suggesting that Gulf War syndrome was in fact a byproduct of the use of depleted uranium munitions in that conflict. And in fact, there are a number of studies in Iraq today where you still have birth defects, elevated levels of cancer that are resultant from this. If we look at the soils of Vietnam and Laos in particular, following the US use of chemical warfare, herbicidal agents during the Vietnam War, there are large swaths of the in the environment that are still unable to be utilized for agricultural purposes. So what I'm getting at here is that the type of weapons that are being used are of such a nature that these will continue to extol a cost on the population for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. The other component that has to be considered is then the rebuilding of the country, and to what extent other governments are going to stand with Ukraine in terms of the rebuilding, or if this is going to be a business opportunity. We can go back through any number of examples through the 20th century. After the Second World War, for example, the Philippines, an ally of the United States, was heavily devastated. And according to some historians outside of Warsaw or Moscow, Manila was probably one of the most heavily damaged cities throughout the conflict. When the United States stepped in to rebuild the Philippines, or at least to facilitate the rebuilding of it, that aid did not come without strings. And in fact, the United States ensured that the Philippines changed their constitution to facilitate other more profitable and beneficial trade relations for the United States. The same thing if we take a look at the relatively recent invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. The United States had already lined up private contractors for the rebuilding of that conflict even before the conflict actually began. So my concern right there is to the extent that there are corporations that are already lining up with the eye towards facilitating profits towards the rebuilding of this. And so the costs are going to continue. The costs are going to be measured both in lives, but the costs are going to be measured in dollars. And once you start talking about those dollars, we're now starting to talk about different opportunities that government and corporations might take advantage, not necessarily to the benefit of the Ukrainian people. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I think there's a range of important points, particularly about the effects of different kinds of weapons that are made there. I guess one of the questions not to be answered now is around the issue of cluster munitions, is the fact that there are some key Western states that have not actually signed up to the ban on cluster munitions, and whether the war and the controversy over the use of these kinds of weapons should provoke a rethink on that issue for those states. Moving on though, our third speaker, as I mentioned before, will be Dr. Karine Koifmann. So over to you.
Thank you. And let me start by saying how important this topic is and what a pleasure it is to be a part of this really significant discussion at this time. So I am a clinical psychologist, and as was mentioned, my research over the last 2 decades has focused on understanding in particular how individuals adapt to highly aversive, sometimes horrific circumstances, with a particular focus on really understanding the psychological processes that drive resilience or healthy adaptation, as well as those processes that contribute to the emergence of psychiatric disorders. And I focus mostly on the onset of disorders that broadly come from stress. So this, of course, includes post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, but also very commonly disorders like depression, anxiety, and substance addiction. Tonight, I want to talk specifically about what we know about individuals in conflict zones and in war. And in particular, I want to start by emphasizing that we actually do know quite a bit. There has been about 30 to 40 years of really excellent research examining rigorously how individuals adapt to conflict and other horrific circumstances across the globe. And so we do have a fairly good understanding of what to expect, including the prevalence of psychiatric disorders, an understanding of both the acute or short-term impacts, as well as the long-term fallout. Unfortunately, humans are prone to conflict. So even in the last 30 to 40 years, there have been tragically many opportunities to do this kind of research, to examine these processes as they're happening on the ground. In fact, some groundbreaking research was actually done right at Kent State University by a former colleague in my department, Stephen Hopful, whose research focused on understanding psychological adaptation in civilians who've been kind of in the midst of the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts. So this has really happened in a number of places around the world, which is helpful in terms of kind of talking about what might happen in Ukraine. So I want to start with describing what we know to be the short-term or the acute impacts on individuals in conflict. And at the very, very basic level, it's important to characterize what we know about how humans operate in a state of acute fear. When we are threatened, our lives, our livelihood, our families, humans have many evolved systems that allow us to respond. And these are adaptations that serve us extremely well in the short term. They were really evolved for that purpose. So for example, fear itself triggers a set of processes that allows us to better perceive and attend to threats. Fear shifts neuroendocrine systems so that we're prepped and ready to move, ready to flee. And these changes and many others shift our physiology, and they have tremendous benefit to us in the short term. However, there can be very significant costs if the threat goes on and on and on. Most important is that these changes that happen can drive physiological and psychological wear and tear. So we begin to see lots of individuals who report things like disruptions in sleep, increased irritability, changes in mood. And at the physiological level, you can see changes in immune function, so increased susceptibility to disease, changes in cardiovascular activity, complaints of aches and pains, gastrointestinal problems, and so on. And in many ways, these are really not symptoms in the true sense of the word. They're just our bodies responding to very significant enduring threats. Now, we know these changes are significant. We've been able to model them and manipulate them in rodent models, for example, for decades. We also know that they are enduring, and they actually can be passed from one generation to the next. So for example, if we back away and we look at human populations over the last century, we've actually been able to see how specific traumatic experiences result in what are called epigenetic shifts, or these are really changes in the processes that turn specific genes in our DNA on and off. And these epigenetic changes can be passed to the next generation. So we were first able to see this in isolated populations who experienced famine, extreme famine in the early part of the 20th century. And the children that were conceived in this time period were born with a greater proportion of epigenetic changes for the genes that regulate metabolism, including increased risk for obesity. And we could translate that to the circumstance we're talking about today. Recently, there's evidence of the transmission of epigenetic changes in the children of Holocaust survivors. And in this case, the children of Holocaust survivors have a greater proportion of these epigenetic changes to the genes that regulate stress processes, making them potentially more susceptible to psychiatric disorders. Now, importantly, these are not changes to actual DNA, right? These are changes to the expression of one's DNA that change or manifest as a consequence of very significant traumatic experiences. And these get passed from one generation to the next. Now, as I mentioned before, in the acute phase of a conflict, there are these kind of symptoms, these difficulties, increased arousal, disruption, changes in mood, and so on. And these are all fairly normative responses to acute stress, as are changes in behavior. So for example, and this can help us to understand some of the news reports we hear of individuals doing different things, people can perceive and tolerate threats in different ways. And this can help to explain why some people flee immediately, others hunker down, and even others will move towards a threat. Some of this is to do with very real and practical circumstances, things like economic resources and social resources. And some of this is basic individual differences in psychological processes. The circumstances on the ground in Ukraine are highly unpredictable. Some areas appear safe today, but then aren't tomorrow, and vice versa. And people respond very differently to that level of ambiguity and instability. And that can drive what can seem like kind of disparate or conflicting or even impulsive behavior. It's kind of hard to understand. Now, I want to move to what happens when that acute phase is over, or really what comes next, and how we can look to research to kind of predict this longitudinal path that people will be on. And there is quite a bit of research that has looked over months and over years of how individuals respond to conflict and other aversive circumstances. And this work has investigated long-term responses to acute events, so things like terrorist attacks and plane crashes, and how we respond to chronic events like pandemics. But also how we respond to the combination of the two. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about conflict and war, which is this kind of enduring, high intensity, stressful experience that's punctuated by kind of acute horrors, really bad moments. And this is really how we've been able to understand or capture the experience for civilians and also for military personnel. And although these may seem like very different kinds of contexts, acute versus chronic versus a mix, actually what we find is across all these types of highly aversive circumstances, we generally see relatively similar pathways or trajectories of human adjustment. And in particular, we know there are really three paths that account for most of the responses from a psychological health perspective in the vast majority of people. So first, the good news, and this is in fact actually very good news, we find that in all of these types of circumstances, including during war, most individuals are quite resilient. Even folks that experience some short-term difficulties and disruptions, some of the things I described before, they can go on most of the time to highly resilient outcomes, which means that they're able to endure the hardships, the change, the unpredictability. They can get back to the business of living, often in new and more challenging circumstances. but with really no long-term psychological cost. We know that this is typically at least half of a population, and in some circumstances, even upwards of 65%. And these are individuals who really can withstand the toll of these kinds of events over the long term and exhibit psychological health, resilient adaptation to very difficult circumstances. Next, there's a group of individuals who struggle, have some difficulty, probably for some period of time, exhibiting some signs of psychiatric illness, some depression, some anxiety, some substance use, some trauma symptoms. And these folks who do struggle will, however, all on their own recover. It just takes them a bit more time. And in fact, this group of individuals doesn't need necessarily any kind of intervention. They simply need time and support because it can take months, even up to a year, for their symptoms to recede all on their own after an event or a conflict is over. And this type of recovery pathway is fairly healthy. You know, we would generally consider it to be that. And we would consider it to be also fairly typical, right? So it's not really disease, but more of an adjustment pattern. However, that being said, there is also still one more group of individuals that we do see over and over again across aversive and often horrific circumstances, and that's individuals who manifest clear symptoms of psychiatric disorders like PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance addiction, which would be the most common in the aftermath of conflict or some other aversive context. And these folks don't recover. These are individuals who need intervention, and the proportion of any population is relatively small, so it can be as few as 10 or 15% of a population, and upwards of 20% depending on the circumstances. But these are individuals who truly have mental illness and do need care. If we think about the population of Ukraine, which is approximately 44 million people, that would be anywhere from 4 to 9 million people who will manifest mental illness in the aftermath of this conflict. That is a lot of people. Now, you may be thinking, who are these people? What makes them vulnerable? Why them and not others? And how do we find them to help them? And this is actually where things get quite a bit more complex. But interestingly, risk for mental illness following conflict is not necessarily due to direct exposure, right? So if you see worse things, you're not more vulnerable necessarily. And it probably has more to do with some key developmental factors and some pre-existing vulnerabilities. And actually this question of who's most vulnerable is actually the particular area of research that my work has focused the most on. And what we know is that for most adults who manifest psychiatric illness in the aftermath of conflict or some other horrible context, the event itself, so in this case, the war itself, doesn't cause the illness. In fact, the propensity towards mental illness was probably already there. And what happens is that the circumstances exacerbate that existing vulnerability. And in fact, in adults, in most cases, when there is a manifestation of illness following something terrible, there was already an episode or experience with mental illness in that person's history. It may have never been diagnosed, but in most cases it's there. And this is important to think about when we're considering really who's most vulnerable. So epidemiological and developmental science suggests that most mental illness manifests relatively early in life, if it will manifest at all. And so typically sometime around the second decade or so, age 22, 23, 24. And most scientific evidence suggests that when the disorders present, they then will come and go over the lifespan depending on circumstance. So what we have when we have a conflict is essentially a perfect storm, right? Where we have individuals who are vulnerable, and then the circumstances tax their resources so much that disease manifests typically again. Okay, and in my lab, we find that this is still true, even when you're talking about highly aversive contexts and the development of PTSD. So the vast majority of adults who will struggle with mental illness in the aftermath of something like this conflict are individuals for whom there already was evidence of difficulty. This doesn't minimize the impact or the concern we should have for those individuals. They still require treatment, resources, and support. I think it just helps to identify who might be the most vulnerable in the future. Now, Importantly, we can't actually say the same kinds of things for children. The risk assessment or the calculation is quite different. And in fact, the picture is much more troubling. War or other highly aversive contexts and circumstances can very clearly cause changes in psychological processes that make children more vulnerable. And in fact, particularly children in the first decade of life, so before the age of 10, when the brain itself is going through some very significant and robust changes in structure and in function, highly aversive circumstances can and have been shown to directly change how the brain operates, and in particular, rapidly mature stress responses. And that maturity has benefits in the short term, but we know changes that individual's neurobiology and psychology in ways that can make that child more vulnerable for the rest of their life. And we know this from some very careful and specific experimental research in non-human primates and rodent models, and then also from some very excellent observational research in children. So it's really quite different depending on the age of the person you're talking about. Finally, I do want to speak to one more thing that's maybe a little bit tangential, but I think very relevant to us sitting here in Northeast Ohio on this panel, and you who are watching us. I want to speak a bit about the trauma, and that's in quotations, of observing these events. In recent days, there have been media reports about media reports and the depiction of carnage, and in particular, horrific still photos and videos of the dead. And these images and these stories are very distressing to all of us. They take a toll emotionally. And for those of us who might be more connected to individuals in Ukraine and to Russia, the toll may be in fact greater. It would be expectable that many of us could begin to experience some of the same kinds of symptoms and difficulties I described in the beginning of my presentation. That being said, although these are very distressing images and stories, and they do take a toll, they are far less likely to contribute to disease states all on their own. We actually know this from some really wonderful and important research that was conducted in the minutes and the hours following the attacks on 9/11, which was in fact really the first time that the media broadcasted horrors in real life, unfiltered to the world of viewers. So the images we see today are horrific and distressing, but thankfully they're probably not disease causing. So in sum, we're looking at a complex and a tragic situation in Ukraine from a psychological standpoint. However, I think it's so important to remember that humans are quite resilient, and that we really know for sure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think what that illustrates is the ripple effects through time and indeed space that conflict produces across a whole sets of different dimensions of factors. I guess one of the questions that it provoked for me as well is whether there's any research on the psychological effects of conflict on the perpetrators, particularly those involved in abuse and war crimes and stuff like that. I don't know whether your research has covered that area, but I'll just leave that as a thing to ponder and maybe come back to later on. So our final speaker today, as I noticed before, is Dr. Helena Vlasenko. So over to you, Polina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in this webinar, and also thank you for organizing it. I am from Ukraine. I was born there. I grew up there. I moved here for my PhD program. I'm from the eastern part of Ukraine, actually, that is on the border with Russia. So I'm from Kharkiv, a big city, 50 kilometers from the border, which is under an intense bombardment right now while we're talking. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the history of my country and about the history of my family, and kind of address the question of the human cost of war using an actual example of this cost. So today, people standing in line to buy some bread in Ukrainian-speaking city Chernihiv, which is in the northern parts of the country, on the border with Belarus, were shot. 13 of them died. They were not soldiers. They were not fascists or Nazi. They were just people under siege who were trying to buy some bread. The same happened in the southern parts of Ukraine and Mariupol, which is a Russian-speaking city, where Russia bombarded a local theater that served as a place where more than 1,000 people were hiding from the war, who already lost their homes. And we still don't know how many of them died. And I'm sorry if that is all very traumatizing. People in Ukraine are subjected to senseless bombardment, military invasion, and violent displacement from their homes by Russia. And I'm going to talk about kind of the way that this war is being justified on the Russian end, and the way that we as Ukrainians see it, and also see the history of our country in relation to it. So Putin, as you probably all know, used distortions of historical facts and misrepresentations of current conditions to justify his attack on the sovereignty and people of Ukraine. He is also using NATO's eastward expansion to obscure his imperialist ambitions in Ukraine and his kind of geopolitical interest in controlling, in acquiring control over the region. In justifying his aggression, he represented Ukraine as a non-sovereign part of Russia, as a historical Russian land. He even represented all of the Soviet Union, all of the republics that belonged to the Soviet Union, which you probably know were very diverse and had really diverse ethnicities, as a historical Russia. And he also justified his attack by saying that Ukraine is ruled by right-wing extremists, and it is committing genocide against the Russian-speaking population. So when he does it, he says that he's attempting at denazification and demilitarization that was already mentioned by the previous speakers. And he's kind of claiming that he's saving Ukrainian people from their own government, sort of thing. So I'm just going to address some of those claims. So first of all, of course, obviously, Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country with a very strong sense of national identity and a very robust civil society that can be seen in a series of mass protests, mobilizations that happened in Ukraine, including Orange Revolution in 2004 and Maidan protests in 2014. It is a country with its own traditions and notable history of democratic struggle. Of course, obviously, it's not fascist, Nazi, or authoritarian state. Ukraine has actual working elections, in contrast to Russia, by the way. And recent elections in 2019, they didn't lead any right-wing party to the parliament. We don't have any right-wing party represented at the parliament currently. And our president is of a Jewish descent, which is kind of creates even more surrealistic picture of the whole situation. Another claim about the discrimination against Russian-speaking population. I myself is a Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. I'm from an eastern parts, from Kharkiv, and was never discriminated against. And I'm gonna go a little bit more into that in a minute. So, of course, obviously, another objection to this story presented by our neighboring country that I have is that, of course, Ukraine has a history of statehood that is quite long. And the way that Russia traces its roots in history, for example, to Kievan Rus, which is a Protestant, which is kind of a federation of different Slavic tribes that existed along the river Dnieper from between 9th and 13th century. It's the same kind of history that, of course, Ukraine is claiming for itself as well, because this formation, this state existed on the current territory of Ukraine. And of course, the tribes, Slavic tribes that were part of it, included those tribes from whom Ukrainians developed later on. And of course, in the between 16th and 18th century, before it was before it became a part of the Russian Empire, Ukraine tried to establish an independent state, and the Cossacks Hetmanat was its name, and it was spanning the lower Dnieper River in central Ukraine, and unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough to oppose two empires that were on its borders. So basically, Russian Empire on one side and Poland on the other side. So unfortunately, in most of these cases in history of Ukraine, it ended up being torn apart and divided between larger imperial forces that surrounded it. Basically, that's the history that Russia is using to justify that there is no state like that because it was part of this larger empires. But that can be said about almost any state in Europe. So maybe in the US, it's not so obvious, but if you live in Europe, you understand that most of the independent states in Europe for the longest period of their time, of their existence, were parts of either Austro-Hungarian Empire or Rich Pospolita, etc. So anyway, so I wanted also to explain this misperception that Russian-speaking people in Ukraine are Russians. That's not the case. So Ukraine is, because of this history of being part of Russian Empire and then being part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine experienced a very long period of what is called Russification. Basically, it's an imposition of Russian language and culture that was seen as a norm, as a universal norm in Ukraine, which basically was a colony. As a result, many people who are Ukrainian ethnically and who also associate themselves with Ukraine and who see their identity as Ukrainian, they speak Russian just because they were born in families that resided in the regions that were Russian speaking. So, for example, so as a result, this kind of language divide doesn't really map onto the ethnic divide. I'm just always want to explain that because I think that very often in like Western press, when they say Russian speakers, they assume that there is some kind of ethnic foundation for it, but not really. And basically, what happened is that Ukraine also during Soviet times and also Russian imperial times, Ukraine had a very strong urban-rural divide as well. So a lot of the cities that were large industrial centers, they became Russian-speaking because first they had universities where the Russian language was imposed and where most of the people studied this language. And then also they had factories where Russia would bring a lot of workers from other regions of Russian Empire, not necessarily ethnic Russians as well. But yeah, so basically Russian was the language that was shared by many ethnicities. So it doesn't really map on being ethnically Russian, or it definitely doesn't map onto having an identity as a Russian and wanting to be part of Russia or whatever. Okay, so yeah, so what I wanted to say about kind of this feeling of being Ukrainian or this idea of being Ukrainian is that it's more about your kind of self-determination and how you define yourself. And it usually has nothing to do with the language that you speak or even your ethnic origin, because of course, no one is gonna kind of conduct DNA tests to find out if they're really Ukrainian or Russian. So everything is much more complicated and based on just your kind of self-determination. And it is true that for a very long period of time, the population in Ukraine has been divided into those who supported the European trajectory of the development of independent Ukraine, and the part of the population that saw Ukraine kind of developing alongside Russia. Also, I wanted to mention that the current misperception of that is that these people who are called pro-Russian, that they supported some sort of separation from Ukraine or being part of Russia. That's also not the case. It wasn't the case before 2014, because what the pro-Russian part of the population wanted is mostly being in economic union with Russia. So basically kind of having trade and being friends. Okay. So I'm going to skip all of the Maidan protests and just go directly into the formation of the independent republics. So I myself, as I mentioned, I'm from Kharkiv. I grew up there and I went to school there, never faced any discrimination or never saw any ethnic conflict present in these areas. I was born in Lugansk, which is now an occupied territory, and my family is from Lugansk. Again, I never saw any hatred between people there before their minds were shaped by the Russian TV that often demonizes Ukrainians and promotes this idea of separation and ethnic conflict. And so in LNR, which is Lugansk People's Republic, and Donetsk People's Republic, what Russia did, it's kind of used this fake evidence of support by the local population and creation of this hatred against Ukrainians to justify, again, their military invasion with the help of Russian propaganda. My family had to flee the area. They had to leave, as well as many other people. Those people who are left there are kind of caught up in all of this situation. They are not really making any choices in these particular conditions, because their alternatives are either they have to just go into nowhere and leave their houses, which not every person is able to do. Not everyone has some place to go, or they just have to come to terms with the fact that like people with weapons raided their streets and are controlling their lives from now on. And of course, there are people who are shaped by this propaganda that I'm talking about, that constantly talks about how Ukrainians are discriminating against Russians. And so this war, Putin is using the same tactics, even though he's bombing not only the cities in the eastern parts. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, he also bombs Chernihiv and Kharkiv and Mykolaiv and Kyiv, which are not at all in the areas of Donbass, which he occupied previously. That only proves that it's not really about self-determination of Donbass or of the local people in Donbass. It's mostly about destabilizing the whole country and kind of shows that he's not going to come to terms with Ukraine as a state that has its own trajectory of development, and he's going to just keep kind of shifting his this war. And so, for example, recently Russia attempted to announce independence of Kherson People's Republic, bringing to Kherson buses with fake supporting crowds, kidnapping Ukrainian activists, and shooting at the protesters against Russian occupation. So the same method that Putin used in Lugansk, he is now using in different cities. So while not only the support Russians showcase on their TV channels is staged by Russian military coercion, but also they are bombing and isolating Russian-speaking cities. So Mariupol, which I mentioned, is a Russian-speaking city. It's without food, water, and electricity for days now, and they do not allow the Ukrainian sides to arrange green corridors to evacuate people. And all of these people, millions also of those who are actually uprooted by the war and who are leaving the country and who are going to, for example, Europe, they are Russian speakers, and they are from Eastern Europe, and they have no interest in Putin saving them, because they are the ones who have their houses destroyed and their children killed from Russian bombs. So and kind of my family who first lost their home in Lugansk, and now they have lost their home in Kharkiv, because now they also had to leave and go to Europe because their city is being bombed, is one of the examples of people like that who don't want to be part of Russia and don't want to be saved by Russia, but are kind of victims to all of this kind of geopolitical lies or lies that are being produced with geopolitical purposes. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very appropriate note to end on. That kind of, it brings the discussion of the human costs down to a very personal human level that I think we can all relate to. So I think that's a very, very powerful way to end the different presentations from the panel. Just to remind people, do pose your questions in either the Q&A facility or through the chat function as well. I think we've had you know, a kind of really rich and varied set of presentations, which have covered a wide range of themes, starting with a kind of review of the latest developments in the war and a discussion about what, you know, the issues are and the debates are around a possible end state for the war. Then a discussion on the kind of human costs of war that accrue, in particular, both long-term and short-term, from the use of specific types of weapons, whether it's cluster munitions, landmines, depleted uranium weapons, and so on and so forth. And then a very rich and fascinating discussion on the psychological evidence that we have on the human costs, the psychological costs of war, both on the victims themselves and on those, I guess, from outside who are viewing what's going on from the outside. And finally, I think a very powerful presentation that did two things. One, I guess, deconstructing some of the Russian narratives and you know, demonstrating the problematic nature of some of those Russian narratives that have been deployed to legitimize the war. And then finally, as I said at the start, I think this kind of, you know, way in which we were brought back to the very personal human consequences of the war in a very direct and personal way. So we've got a number of questions that have been posed. I've got two already, and I guess I kind of lobbed in some questions of my own as well that you may wish to consider but have no obligation to do. So the first one is a question that says, is it possible to consider that the Russians will, I guess, prolong the war to genocide, that will kind of move the war from, I guess, will move into a regime of genocide? I guess there's also already a question about whether that is the current condition or not. And I think related to that, there is this a kind of related question, is this question around whether the Russians will use chemical weapons. I think my own variation of that may also be, actually, why have the Russians not used chemical weapons so far, given that they've had a history and a record of using them in the past? So, you know, is there some reason that they're holding back? What would that be? What would that reason be? A further question that we've had is, how likely is it that Putin is assassinated? And so I'll kind of leave it there and open it up to the panel. I don't know who wants to go with either of those questions, to respond to either of those questions. Or the questions that I posed.
I suppose I could say something, or I think in terms of the chemical weapon component, a scenario that has been discussed, and one that I would be more concerned about, is that the Russians would use some type of false flag operation, or they would deliberately try to sabotage one of the nuclear power plants. And so they can effectively use chemical or nuclear warfare and trying to maintain a level of deniability. So, you know, I would anticipate that. I think that, again, speculation, I think one of the reasons why he hasn't used it yet, although he has used it in other countries, is because of the global attention that is being directed to it. I think that if I think he possibly underestimated what the global response was going to be. Perhaps this was a continuation of the relationship that he had under Trump, and he assumed maybe the United States wouldn't necessarily take this terribly seriously and look the other way. I think, frankly, there's ongoing genocides in Myanmar right now, and the world is ignoring that. There's, ongoing genocide / mass violence in Yemen, in various places around the world. And Putin probably was caught off guard that people actually cared in this situation. So now he's adjusting on the fly. Whether or not this results in a form of genocide, I think that there's a debate that will be played out long term in terms of how we understand genocide. I think that there's a tendency that we put genocide on a spectrum, that somehow genocide is worse than mass violence. And there's a legal definition to the genocide dealing with the particular groups in question, the intentionality and so forth. Just because something isn't called genocide doesn't mean it's horrific. And I do think that the longer this goes on, there's a greater likelihood that we are going to see considerably more mass violence. Just today, it was announced on CNN that a theater that was sheltering children was targeted. So whether we call it genocide today or not is not going to negate the fact that we probably will see considerably more violence and intentional targeting of civilians moving forward.
Okay, anybody else want to respond either to the questions from the audience or some of the questions that I raised? Or do we want to?
I'm just wondering about the question of genocide as well. If you look at the text of Putin's speeches, sort of a rejection of the entire identity of Ukraine as a nation, a failure to recognize it as a nation with its own agency. I think behind that is this notion of eradication, which is extremely frightening.
Okay, and I guess another couple of questions that are quite important here, and particularly kind of picking up on that question of the fact that genocide and war crimes are being perpetrated elsewhere. I mean, one of the questions is kind of centered around the fact that actually we're seeing the West reacting very strongly and deploying this discourse around the horrors of war crimes that are being perpetrated by the Russians, and the answer here is to provide arms to Ukraine. But in other contexts, and Jim mentioned the Yemen, we've seen the West and the US included supplying arms to countries that have been engaged in not dissimilar kinds of war crimes. So what is is there a particular reason here? How do we understand, that deployment of that kind of moral empathy that seems to be there for Ukraine, but not for, say, victims in Yemen? Is there a different kind of politics, geopolitics going on? Is there different sets of humanitarian logics that are going on? Anybody want to have a go at that one?
I could wade in, but I don't want to dominate the conversation here.
Do you want to have a go?
I think that there's a number of considerations here. And first off, when you listen to some of the broadcasters and they're talking about their shock that this type of violence is occurring in a European city, there is a level of racism. There's a level of religious prejudice that's involved. But there's also a very strong economic component to this. The Ukraine situation is fundamentally tied into energy politics. Places like Yemen, less so. Places like Sudan, less so. Places like Somalia, less so. Places like Myanmar, less so. If you probe a little bit deeper and you try to understand some of the geopolitics in these other situations, there is an economic component and a land issue in Myanmar, for example. However, that directly impinges on China's policies. And so you're going to have discussions, certainly not privy for me to listen in on, between the United States and China and how they're going to respond or not respond in that situation. So there's this sort of visual response that we're seeing with CNN, with Fox, with MSNBC that are paying attention because, you know, these are Europeans and you don't have that same consideration going on in the Middle East. My fear is that, and we're already starting to see it here, my fear is that as this conflict continues, it's not going to occupy the media's interest sufficiently to keep the reporters there, keep the 24-hour coverage. It's going to be forgotten and it's going to continue to grind on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Any comments?
You know, I could just jump in a little bit. I think, you know, an important piece of this is just fundamentally a little bit of a kind of identification process that's happening with the West, right? These are, you know, we feel like Ukrainians are like us. And unfortunately, we're much more willing to help those individuals who we then connect with and relate to. It's a very basic kind of psychological thing that happens amongst people. It's a kind of a little bit of a tribal in-group, out-group kind of a thing. And, you know, tragically, we don't pay attention when we don't connect to a population, despite the fact that horrific things happen all the time, everywhere. And we just simply don't. And so I think there is this kind of emotional component that's present here. And frankly, to the credit of many Ukrainians, including the president, by also making us look at it, right? It happened today in Congress and forcing, you know, politicians to really see these things and make analogies to experiences in US history. And that's very powerful as a psychological tool, right? To kind of connect with people and to drive empathy and action. And if that process can be maintained and we don't fatigue, there isn't fatigue, right? Then the attention will stay.
Thanks. And another question that I think arises from the discussion is really, you know, we had that kind of discussion at the start on you know, the negotiations that are going on in the background around what an end state might look like. And I guess that begs two questions. One is, you know, what is the research out there? What do we know about the kind of psychology of you know, negotiating, doing mediation and conflict resolution? Are there factors there that can, you know, facilitate and break down those enemy images that you know, the negotiators have of each other and actually facilitate kind of productive negotiations? So that would be one question. And then I guess the question, you know, would be also what you know, is there an end state that would work for you know, the Ukrainian people? Is there you know, what is the, you know, what would be acceptable to the government and to the Ukrainian people? Who wants to go on that one?
I mean, I'm not an expert in conflict negotiation or anything like that. But I could simply say that, you know, at the very basis of disputes, right, has to be, you know, it's really like fighting for some resources. It's on so many levels, this is really about economics. And history and identity, right? And so finding the two sides, which in so many ways have been described as really the same family, right? So Russians have Ukrainian family members, Ukrainians have Russian family members. And so just having them remember that they're actually the same family might make some of the fighting stop. And in fact, it speaks a little bit to the question you mentioned after my presentation about what's the cost on the military. And then from Karl's presentation, the first one talking about the lack of morale, the low morale in the Russian forces causing trouble for them. And there is really this conflict, right? If you're perpetrating violence on your family, you're not going to be really inspired to do so. You have to imagine them as something other than that. But that's also the path to connection and communication as well.
Okay, and we've had a question in the chat about the kind of generational trauma and what are the kind of factors that influence that kind of intergenerational trauma. Are you able to speak to that?
Sure. I don't see the question, so hold on.
Oh,
yeah. So I can imagine that this is incredibly challenging for the Russian people and for the Russian people who are hearing, right, the truth as opposed to the propaganda that's being perpetuated. And I do think that there's probably a lot of within family conflict around this that makes it quite difficult. The truth is, we actually know that, and this speaks to your question, Neil, in the beginning about the impacts on military. There is, I talked about 3 kind of pathways, right, to health or disease. There's really actually a 4th that involves kind of a delayed response that is thought to be more common in military personnel, and it has to do with the perpetration of violence, right? So when you are a military person in a combat zone, right, you see horrible things happening to other people, happening to your teammates, right, happening to civilians, but you also perpetrate violence. And so there's this kind of secondary trauma that can happen. And I would imagine that for Russian soldiers who are perpetrating violence on Ukrainians and they can see each other as the same, it would be even more challenging and even more difficult to actually execute and not suffer from.
okay, thanks very much. I think we're pretty much up against time. So I'm looking at Sandra here just to, yes. So I think we'll kind of round up and finish and just say thank you very much to the panelists. I think this has been a very rich and varied discussion, and we've been able to get a wide range of different perspectives from different disciplinary backgrounds and different approaches. And I think the audience will now be kind of much better informed about the wide and varied range of dimensions associated with the war in Ukraine. So before we finish, however, I just want to hand over now to Robert Peralta, the head of the Center for Conflict Management at the University of Akron, who's going to finish with some concluding remarks and also introduce a brief video clip that we would like to close with.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I kind of want to start by saying thank you to Dr. Vlasenko and to everybody, but Dr. Vlasenko, my thoughts are with you and your family and in Ukraine. We're thinking of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just from a question of mediation and conflict resolution, it's just hard for me to wrap my mind around it because Putin, we're talking with an autocracy versus a democracy where this person is defining a history that makes no rational sense from our perspective in a democratic state. And for resolution to take place, you kind of need to have a common understanding what the problem is. So this is what makes it really, really complex. Yeah, and I want to thank all the speakers for your generosity of time and your expertise. It's really needed right now. An opportunity to engage in dialogue. We can learn from one another. I certainly learn from everybody. So thank you very, very much. I want to thank Neil Cooper, Doctors Cooper and Molina for organizing this and working with me to bring University of Akron over on board. I also want to thank Sandra Morgan for helping us bring our campuses together. Again, I'm really excited by multidisciplinary insight. So I think this is really, really helpful, especially in this really concerning conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So yes, we're going to leave you with a little hope, inspiring video, right? This is a Ukrainian violinist, Bodarenko. He's playing a solo rendition of a Ukrainian folk song in a bomb shelter in Kiev. And he's joined by 98 musicians from all over the globe. So we'll leave you with that. Thank you everybody for coming and learning with us all. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And if you'll give me one moment to share my screen. we will move on to the music, which of course it has just popped off my screen now. So you'll give me 1 second to find it again. Oh my goodness. Sorry.
So I think with that, we'll say goodbye to everybody, and thank you for attending this latest in our series of panels. Thank you.
Thank you.